It hasn't been a great few days as far as internet censorship and related issues go, has it? The Russell Brand's situation, he certainly seems guilty as hell, with multiple accusers who have not been in communication with one another, physical evidence and everything else. But that's really not the point, because there are plenty of people who don't have seemingly airtight cases against them, who have been censored under similar circumstances. And the Russell Brand thing just seems like a good opportunity to shine a light onto all of that and the importance of due process and all of these other things that are going on. You know, that seems far more appropriate as a topic than the mere gossip that goes on around Russell Brand. A letter has emerged with typos, seemingly coming from one of the little sort of subgroups of Parliament here in the UK to do with the Ministry of Culture and Sport, apparently creating pressure on sites such as TikTok, Rumble and so on about the monetization of brands' content. A step I don't think they did during the height of COVID, when the issue would have been, genuinely harmful misinformation being spread about the disease and the vaccinations and about masks and social distancing and all the rest of it, which, he very much took part in and doubtless contributed to a few deaths. But they seemingly didn't go that far previously, but they have gone that far as to apply pressure to these platforms. Now that he's been accused of sexual assault, rape, and other issues. And this seems to have surprised a lot of people, that governments do this, that they reach out via back channels and they apply pressure to platforms to try and get them to demonetize or shadow ban or remove people from those platforms when they're creating content that those governments don't like. But this isn't new. This isn't new at all. Because I have a bit of an obsession with free expression, free speech, internet freedoms and so on, it sometimes somehow surprises me when people don't know about these things, because this is nothing new and it isn't surprising at all in any way, shape or form. Most governments do this, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly, and a lot of this censorship, this control of content and so on, comes from governments but not through governments, because in many jurisdictions there are free speech rights enshrined in constitutions, laws, agreements, treaties and so on, which means that a government cannot necessarily act directly to censor somebody. The government can't, in a lot of jurisdictions, make a law saying you can't say this, you can't say that. There's variations obviously, but there are usually free speech protections in various places against the government. And this is why I tend to take a larger, broader view of free speech rights, free expression rights than a lot of Americans do, because you'll hear this common refrain that free speech rights are supposed to protect you from the government, and then they ignore private censorship. But here we find this synergistic censorship where it's coming from the government, but it is enforced by private companies, sometimes under threat, sometimes just to keep their markets open and to keep a government sweet on them. So this is censorship that does come from governments, but is enforced via private bodies who you're not protected against via free speech regulations. And this is why I have previously often suggested that our various rights need to be protected in law, not just from our governments, but from private institutions, private companies, banks, social media companies, and so on, in the same way that we have extended protections for minorities from discrimination. We should extend those protections that give us our free speech and free expression rights into the private sphere as well. There's been a lot of pushback to that idea from a lot of people, but I think it is a genuine problem, but it's not new and it's not surprising, but a lot of people are treating it as new and surprising that governments apply pressure and censorship via private intermediaries. Here in the UK, we've also had the Online Safety Bill, which is one signature away from becoming law. And this creates unenforceable demands on removing content from the internet, particularly from social media. Companies doing more to counteract bullying, hateful content, all of that kind of stuff. And this is more censorship via a cause célèbre, really. There was a kid not too far away from me, within my local television catchment area, who was bullied relentlessly via social media, and then was lured via a text message or series of text messages from a girl out to a location where he was stabbed to death by his bullies. And so this has been the cause which the government has then used to push for censorship laws that they've been trying to create for some time. Now, if these kids had organised via telephone and text message outside of social media, would the government be arguing that the phone companies should be monitoring everything that is said over phone lines and granting snooping rights over that, or even suggesting that telephones should be removed from the hands of children and teenagers? Probably not, but because it's the internet, somehow that seems to be okay. So yeah, it has not been a good couple of days. Look, censorship is still censorship no matter who is doing it and whether they have a good reason or not. So the question is not really, or should not be, whether something is censorship. The question should be whether the censorship is justified. And that's where you apply the harm principle. Debanking, demonetization, the increasing centralization of so much power in certain companies online, the trash reputation of alternatives, forcing people to use diminished services or pay extra charges. None of this is fair, and in a world that is increasingly wired up, we all need to have access to many of these services, social media, online banking, all the rest of it, and yet all of these things are under threat. And yeah, at the moment it might be the Russell Brands and it might be the Nigel Farages that are getting threatened, and they're horrible people and maybe they deserve it, but eventually it spreads to other people, and it already has, but it gets less headlines. If you work in adult entertainment, your bank is fairly likely to close your account and not let you have your money for a while. PayPal is likely to close your account, and they're notorious for stealing people's money. And so it goes, and so it goes, and so it goes. And here on YouTube, the restrictions on what we can say, what we can do, how much we can swear, what topics we can talk about, are now absurdly more restrictive than they are on broadcast television, which makes you question what is the point of YouTube if it is more restrictive and more difficult than broadcast television. That's its niche, its appeal is that it isn't these other things. So restricting it in such a way just seems insane. And it's all much less transparent than broadcast media or newspapers or whatever else are. You know, this encourages a culture of paranoia that is probably justified. Am I being shadow banned? How can I adjust my presentation so the algorithm elevates me rather than punishing me? You know, it makes you on edge constantly, never knowing what is going to work and what isn't, and what did I do wrong. And it's with AI doing so much of it, what's running the censorship is a little black box that nobody can see inside, even the people who are using it to do censorship for themselves because of these learning algorithms. So we don't necessarily know what's setting it off. And add to that, outside of that, this culture of virtue signaling, deflection, and public displays of hatred that we have, and it's not good, is it? And we have to adjust, as we did to the printing press, especially as now we've lost the anonymity that used to act as a buffer, the 4chan philosophy of not knowing anything about the person you're talking to, which means you talk about the content rather than the person. That's been lost. That is dead now. You can give up on that outside of a few obscure corners of the internet. But that means it's even more urgent that we adapt. I bring up the printing press example because most people's encounters with the written word before the advent of the printing press, that was the Bible, and it was the word of God, and it was interpreted for you by special people, priests. And so people took any printed word, any written word, as gospel. And that meant that political pamphleteering and so on that occurred around the English Civil War was just taken as true, without any critical faculties being engaged. And it took a while for people to learn to cope with the written word being non-biblical, not being the word of God, not being absolutely true by virtue of being written down. You can find essays and recountings of this, and we adjusted fairly quickly. But to the internet, we don't seem to be able to engage in critical thinking at the same sort of societal scale that is necessary to cope with all this. And this censorship of Brand, these letters and so on, the fact that he hasn't been convicted of anything, and this is going on, however guilty he seems, that only feeds people's paranoia and distrust and makes people more sympathetic to Brand, whether or not he's done anything. And it certainly seems like he has. And surely that's counterproductive, isn't it? Zang.
Hi, I'm Skip Breakfast, and you're watching Newsload. We're getting reports of a new card game which purports to make fun of the political and social hellscape in which we find ourselves, somehow turning this into a fun pastime for groups of slightly drunken friends to try and outdo each other. But there's one important question on everyone's lips: just how exactly do you play?